The air in the locker room was dense, loaded with the metallic smell of sweat and the quiet tension that preceded the inevitable. Zev Almog, commander of Shayat 13, felt the weight of every gaze that fell on him, not as a burden, but as the confirmation of a responsibility that shaped every fiber of his being. His men, the Naval Special Operations elite, were ready. There was no bravado, just the solemn stillness of one who understands the magnitude of what is to come. Zev was not a leader who hid behind orders. He was the tip of the spear, the first to advance, the last to retreat. His reputation was not built on myths, but on a series of calculated decisions, many of them made under the most intense fire, always with the lives of his subordinates in the foreground. The mission that night, however, transcended ordinary military tactics. It was not just a target, but a symbol. In the heart of the Gulf of Suez, the artificial military island stood as a monument to Egyptian confidence, an impregnable fortress, a bastion of absolute security. To the enemy command, she was the embodiment of invulnerability, isolated by a maze of sea mines, barbed wire fences, searchlights that swept through the darkness incessantly, and cross-firing positions that promised annihilation to any intruder. The idea that a force would dare to attempt the impossible was, for them, a chimera. But for Zev and his strategists, the island wasn't just concrete and steel. It was an illusion to be undone, a certainty to be broken. The goal was not to conquer, nor to maintain. It was to infiltrate, dismantle the island's vital systems, and disappear before the sun kissed the horizon, leaving behind only silence, confusion, and the certainty that no fortress, no matter how well defended, was truly invulnerable. It was a message, written not in ink but with the surgical precision of a clandestine operation. For weeks, the life of Shayat 13 was reduced to an exact replica of the island, built with an almost clinical obsession. Every corridor, every ladder, every defensive position was memorized, internalized. The men moved through that labyrinth of wood and canvas as if it were an extension of their own bodies. The steps synchronized, the movements fluid, the breathing controlled. Zev observed, corrected, pushed. He knew that technical perfection was only the surface. Underneath there were men, each carrying his own invisible burden, his own doubts and hopes that were not on any map. Aitan, the silent veteran, was one of those men. His eyes, marked by countless missions, carried a dark wisdom. He had seen too much to believe in clean operations and flawless plans. His caution was not pessimism, but a realism forged in the furnace of experience. Before boarding, Aitan approached Zev, his eyes meeting those of the commander. There was no need for words. A subtle nod, a mutual recognition of the abyss that was opening up ahead. Zev knew that Aitan would be the anchor, the necessary counterpoint to his own ruthless determination. Yonah, the youngest on the team, was the opposite. His anxiety was a fire contained under strict discipline, a desperate need to prove that he deserved to be there, among those giants. He studied every detail, every instruction, with an almost feverish intensity. Zev saw in him the reflection of a distant past, the same hunger for validation, the same thirst for belonging. He knew that Yonah, despite her inexperience, would bring an energy and dedication that could be crucial. Ariel, the demolitions expert, kept his humor dry as a barrier, a way to ward off thoughts that insisted on coming back during rehearsal nights. He was the master of controlled destruction, able to disable a complex system as easily as he disarmed a joke. But behind the facade of sarcasm, Zev perceived the same tension that corroded others, the same awareness of risk. Just before departure, Zev rallied his men one last time. There were no inflammatory speeches, just a reinforcement of the essentials. Success, he said, his voice low but loaded with authority, will not be in staying but in leaving. Infiltrate, dismantle, disappear. That's all that matters. He looked at each one, his eyes conveying the confidence he hoped to see reflected. Responsibility was a heavy cloak on his shoulders, the life of each of those men a silent promise he had made to himself. Fear, for Zev, was not an emotion to be avoided, but a fuel to be managed, a tool to sharpen the mind and senses. The urgency of the mission was not only the deadline of dawn, but the need to preserve life, to fulfill the objective without unnecessary losses. The night chosen was dark, without a moon, the sea a mirror of paint that swallowed any trace of light. Shayat 13 moved forward in absolute silence. First in larger vessels, which took them to a safe launch point away from prying eyes. Then, in inflatable boats, which cut through the water with an almost inaudible whisper. Finally, swimming, the bodies merging with the liquid darkness, each stroke an act of faith and precision. The commandos exploited the brief intervals between the beams of the searchlights, moving like shadows between the dark water and the cold concrete of the island. The structure seemed asleep, confident in its own invulnerability, a giant beast that breathed slowly under the protection of the night. Zev led, his senses sharpened, every muscle tense but under control. He felt the current, the salty smell of the sea, the cold that penetrated his wetsuit. Every detail was a piece of information, every sound a potential threat. The initial infiltration was almost perfect. Small teams scaled the wet walls, the hooks finding support in crevices and ledges, the movement smooth and calculated. They dispersed according to plan, each man a link in an invisible chain, moving toward their appointed targets. Time seemed suspended, each second an eternity of contained tension. Zev, already inside the island in a narrow, damp corridor, heard the muffled sound of a distant alarm, a noise that seemed to come from nowhere and from everywhere at once. It was not the shrill and continuous sound they expected, but something more subtle, more insidious. A detail out of place, an unexpected reflex. The illusion of control, so meticulously constructed, began to crumble. Zev felt a shiver down his spine, an icy foreboding that had nothing to do with the humidity in the air. The silent operation, which was supposed to be a shadow dance, was about to turn into something much more chaotic and claustrophobic. The island, once organized and predictable in his rehearsals, was beginning to reveal its true face, a labyrinth of narrow corridors, metal stairs, and cramped compartments that would become, in moments, zones of extreme tension. The night, which promised to be a veil of invisibility, now seemed to tighten around them, revealing every movement, every breath. The urgency, once an internal pressure, now manifested itself in a distant but unmistakable echo of hurried footsteps and loud voices. The game had changed. The island, once a meticulously drawn mental map, now revealed itself to be a labyrinth of echoes and shadows. The alarm, which Zev had heard as a distant whisper, quickly turned into a cacophony of hurried voices and footsteps, reverberating through the concrete corridors. The illusion of a silent infiltration crumbled with each accelerated beat of his heart. The adrenaline, once a controlled flow, now ran wild, sharpening his senses to an almost painful point. He could smell the smell of damp metal, the acrid smell of sweat, and the indistinct smell of something burning in the distance. His eyes, accustomed to dim light, tried to decipher the shapes that moved in the intermittent darkness, illuminated only by the erratic beams of the searchlights that now swept the interior of the fortress with a frenzied urgency. Zev knew that the plan, as obsessive as it was only a guide. The reality of the operation always brought with it the unforeseen, the chaos inherent in any confrontation. But the speed with which the situation had escalated was alarming. What had been an out-of-place detail was now an avalanche. He moved, his steps steadied despite the tension, rifle drawn, his mind racing to recalibrate to find a new way through the clutter. Internal communication, once a constant flow of information, was now fragmented, punctuated by static and muffled screams. "Status, Delta Team," Zev hissed into the microphone of his radio, his voice low but charged with command. The answer came from Yona, the youngest, his voice tense but controlled. "Eye contact with Patrol Commander, imminent engagement. We are moving to the secondary position according to Plan B." Zev nodded to himself, a silent acknowledgement of the young man's discipline. Yona was under pressure, but she was thinking. That was good. But then, Eitan's voice burst out on the radio, deeper, more urgent. "Commander, Alpha Team is under heavy fire. It seems that we were detected earlier than expected in the East Wing. We need support or we will be fixed." Zev's heart tightened. The Alpha Team was crucial in disabling radars, the first and most vital objective. Without blinding the island, the retreat would be suicide. The ambiguity of the initial information, that unexpected reflection, now materialized into a concrete threat, a wall of fire that prevented the advance. The central emotional conflict set in, the fear of failure, the responsibility for the lives of his men, the distrust of the very invulnerability of the plan. Zev felt the weight of the impending decision. Moving towards the final goal, as the original plan dictated, meant leaving the Alpha Team isolated, potentially sacrificing them. Retreating to support them would put the entire mission at risk, delaying the deactivation of the systems and exposing everyone to prolonged combat time. The emotional deadline, the approaching dawn, made every second a torture. "Eitan, what is the exact situation? How many enemies? Do you have coverage?" Zev tried to extract as much information as possible, his mind processing scenarios at breakneck speed. Eitan's response was cut short by bursts of gunfire. "Hard to say, Commander. Many, they knew where we were. It looks like an ambush." An ambush. The word echoed in Zev's mind. How? The planning had been impeccable, the replica of the island studied to exhaustion. Would it be a leak, an intelligence failure? Or just the chaos of war, the unpredictability that no amount of training could eradicate? Doubt was a subtle poison, eroding the confidence he had worked so hard to maintain. Zev was in a corridor leading directly to the command center, his main target. A few meters away, a solid steel door. He could hear the muffled sound of voices on the other end, the hum of electronic equipment. The goal was there, within reach, but the Alpha Team was in danger. He turned to Ariel, the demolitions expert, who stood beside him, his eyes fixed on the door. "Ariel, can you open this quietly?" Ariel nodded, already preparing his tools. "Silent, Commander, but it won't be quick, and the noise of the fighting outside doesn't help." Zev knew he didn't have time for a quick no. Every second was vital. He needed a decision, and he needed it now. Acting quickly, advancing towards the goal, could generate unknown future consequences, a moral cost that he would have to carry. But the alternative, to retreat, was equally terrible. It was then that a blinding flash erupted from a side corridor, followed by a deafening crash. Zev felt a shockwave that threw him against the wall. A sharp pain exploded in his left shoulder. He staggered, the rifle falling from his hands for an instant before he grabbed it again, the pain radiating down his arm. A shrapnel, he realized, had hit his shoulder. It wasn't severe enough to incapacitate him, but the pain was a distraction, a cruel reminder of vulnerability. "Commander!" Eitan shouted on the radio, his voice now closer, more desperate. "We are retreating. We couldn't keep the position. They are coming from all sides." The voice of Eitan, the wary veteran, now carried a tone of despair that Zev had rarely heard. That was a sign, an ambiguous signal perhaps. Eitan was a man who rarely showed panic. His voice at that moment could be interpreted as a cry for urgent help, or as a confirmation that the situation was irrecoverable for the Alpha Team. Zev gritted his teeth, the pain in his shoulder pulsing in sync with the urgency of the situation. He looked at Ariel, who was watching him with an expression of concern. "Ariel, forget silence. Open that door. Now." Ariel nodded, his movements quick and precise. The sound of metal tools against the steel filled the hallway, a shrill noise that seemed to defy the night itself. Zev knew he was exposing his position, but there was no other choice. He needed the command center. While Ariel was working, Zev picked up the radio again. "Yona, what is your position? Can you outflank the East Wing and relieve the pressure on Eitan?" Yona's voice came, panting. "We are moving, Commander, but there is a lot of resistance. It seems like they're waiting for us around every corner." The island, once a symbol of absolute safety for the enemy, now became a maze of traps for them. Egyptian confidence in the invulnerability of the fortress had turned into a trap, a lure to lure and annihilate. Zev felt the blood run down his arm, hot and sticky. The pain was a constant reminder, but he pushed it to the back of his mind. He needed to think. He needed to act. The Alpha team was in trouble. The command center needed to be neutralized. Time was running out. The door finally gave way with a metallic creak, revealing a dark, silent hallway. Zev hesitated for a moment, the image of Eitan and his team under heavy fire flashing in his mind. Eitan's voice, the tone of despair. The dilemma was clear, brutal. Moving towards the final goal meant leaving them behind. To retreat would put the entire mission at risk. He looked back at the corridor where the sounds of battle were coming from. The decision was made there, under absolute pressure, a weight that settled on his chest. The goal was adjusted, not abandoned. But the emotional cost of the choice, Zev knew, would mark everyone involved. He could not save everyone. He couldn't do everything. He was a commander, not a god. And that was the bitterest truth of all. Ariel, Yona, focus on the command center and radars. Eitan, try to regroup and meet us at the secondary extraction point. I repeat, secondary extraction point. We can't wait. Zev's voice was firm, but with each word he felt a piece of himself break. He was abandoning a part of his team, even if temporarily. Even if for a greater cause. It was a decision that would haunt him. He advanced into the dark hallway, the pain in his shoulder a constant reminder of the price of war, of the fragility of life, of the impossibility of absolute control. The island, once a symbol of security, was now a stage for disorder, a testimony to the shattering of an illusion. And Zev, the experienced commander, felt the weight of every step, every decision, every life that was in his hands. The night was still long, and the dawn, which had previously represented the end of the mission, now seemed a distant and uncertain horizon, loaded with unknown consequences. Zev's shoulder pain was a constant, a pulsating reminder of the brutality of reality that imposed itself on meticulous planning. The blood, which had once flowed, now coagulated under the fabric of her clothing, creating a sticky, uncomfortable sensation. But the physical pain was secondary to the anguish that had settled in his chest. The decision to leave Alpha Team behind, to prioritize the larger goal over the immediate safety of its men, was a heavy burden. He felt the echo of Eitan's words, the despair contained in the veteran's voice, and every sound of the battle that still reverberated through the corridors of the island seemed to amplify his guilt. Zev and Ariel advanced down the corridor that led to the command center, the darkness punctuated only by flashing emergency lights that flashed with an irregular frequency, like a dying heart. The air was heavy with the smell of ozone and burning metal, a harbinger of the coming destruction. Yona and his team, in turn, had veered into the radar wing, facing fierce resistance but staying focused. Communication with them was sporadic, but with each brief contact, Zev felt the tension in the young man's voice, determination mixed with inexperience. Commander, we have strong resistance here. It seems that they have tightened the security of the radars. We're moving forward, but it's going to take time, Yona reported, her voice drowned out by distant gunfire. Zev gritted his teeth. Time was the most implacable enemy. Every minute that passed increased the risk of being intercepted, of being cornered. The island, once a dormant fortress, now awoke with an unexpected fury. The Egyptians, confident in their invulnerability, were reacting with a coordination that Zev had not anticipated. This was an ambiguous signal. Was it the desperate reaction of a surprised force, or confirmation that Eitan's ambush was not a fluke? He and Ariel finally reached the door of the command center. It was a robust, reinforced structure, but Ariel, with her expertise, was already evaluating the best way to deactivate it. Commander, this door is more complex than the others. I'll need a few minutes to disable the locking system. We can't break in without drawing too much attention. Zev nodded, his mind already elsewhere. He leaned against the cold wall, trying to ignore the pain in his shoulder and focus on the situation. The emotional progression of the mission was a whirlwind. The initial confidence forged in weeks of obsessive training now gave way to growing frustration. Each decision seemed to close more and more future possibilities, cornering them on an increasingly narrow path. He thought of Aitan. What would be happening with the Alpha team? He had given the order to retreat to the secondary extraction point, but he knew that in the heat of combat, things rarely went as planned. The image of Aitan, the veteran skeptic, with his eyes that had seen too much, haunted him. He had trusted Zev, and Zev had left him behind. Suddenly, a metallic shuffling sound echoed down the hallway, coming from the opposite direction to the one they had reached. Zev and Ariel looked at each other. It was not the sound of hurried footsteps nor of gunshots. It was something heavier, slower, as if something was being dragged. Zev raised his rifle, pointing into the darkness. His senses were on high alert. "Commander, I'm hearing something too," Ariel whispered, his tools suspended. "It doesn't seem to be a normal patrol." The hazard light flashed again, revealing for an instant a tall, burly figure at the end of the hallway. He was no ordinary Egyptian soldier. The man wore a different, more formal uniform and carried what appeared to be a large-caliber sniper rifle. His movements were slow, deliberate, almost as if he were hunting. Zev felt a chill. That figure did not fit any of the security profiles they had studied. It was an element of surprise, an error of judgment perhaps, in his assumption that the island would be defended only by regular troops. The presence of that sniper, or whatever it was a sign that their intelligence was incomplete, or that the situation had escalated to a level they hadn't anticipated. "Ariel, quick, we need to come in," Zev hissed, his voice strained. Ariel redoubled her efforts, the sound of her tools more frantic. The shooter was advancing slowly, his footsteps echoing in the hallway. Zev knew they wouldn't have time to disable the door and engage that enemy at the same time. He needed a distraction. He grabbed a smoke grenade from his belt, pulled the pin and threw it down the hallway, in the direction of the shooter. The grenade exploded with a hiss, releasing a dense, suffocating cloud that quickly filled the space. Zev heard a muffled coughing sound, but the gunman did not back down. He kept moving forward, his silhouette now indistinct in the smoke, but his presence still menacing. "Commander, the door!" Ariel exclaimed, finally managing to deactivate the locking system. The door creaked, opening just enough for them to slip inside. Zev pushed Ariel inside and followed him, closing the door behind him with a dull thud. They were inside the command center. The environment was dark, lit only by monitors that displayed data and maps in green and blue. The smell of electronics and stale coffee hung in the air, but the feeling of relief was brief. The door was not locked, just closed. The shooter was still outside, and he knew they were there. The island, which was supposed to be a target, now looked like a trap. Zev moved quickly, assessing the environment. Monitors, consoles, tactical maps. The heart of the island. He could hear the muffled sound of gunfire and explosions coming from other parts of the fortress, constant reminder of the chaos unfolding. "Yona, radar status," Zev called out on the radio, his most urgent voice. The answer came, but it was distorted, full of static. "Commander, we managed. One of the disabled, but resistance. Strong." Communication was failing. This was a serious problem. Without communication, coordination would be impossible. Zev felt frustration grow, a tight knot in his stomach. Each step, each decision seemed to lead to a new obstacle, a new complication. He and Ariel got to work quickly, disabling the command center's systems. Cables were cut, panels were opened, circuits were destroyed. The island, which had previously operated with military precision, was now beginning to become disorganized, its vital systems being ripped away piece by piece. But the feeling of victory was hollow. The image of Aitan, Yona's voice full of static, the menacing presence of the sniper outside. All of this was mixed in a cacophony of doubts and regrets. Zev had made a difficult decision, a decision he believed was the only possible one for the success of the mission. But the emotional cost, he realized, was far greater than he had imagined. Emotional rupture was imminent. The frustration with the situation, the distancing of part of his team, the disillusionment with the perfection of the plan, the deep doubt about his own choices. All of this piled up, creating unbearable pressure. The island was not just a military target, it was a mirror, reflecting the flaws and frailties of its own humanity. And the dawn, which once represented the conclusion, now seemed like a trial, a moment of reckoning with the consequences of his actions. The door to the command center, although closed, did not offer the security Zev desired. With every beat of his heart, he felt the presence of the sniper outside, a lingering shadow that refused to disappear. Smoke from the grenade still hung in the hallway, but Zev knew it was only a temporary delay. That enemy, whoever he was methodical, patient, and would not be easily deterred. The pain in his left shoulder was a constant reminder of his own vulnerability, a wound that, while not crippling, drained his energy and concentration. Inside the command center, Zev and Ariel worked with feverish urgency. Cables were cut, panels were torn off, circuits were destroyed. The island, which had once pulsed with the life of its electronic systems, now began to fall silent, its eyes and ears being gouged out one by one. The monitors, once full of data and maps, now flashed with error messages, their screens becoming dark one by one. The destruction was methodical, surgical, but with each system disabled, Zev felt a void, a sense that something else was being lost beyond the enemy's operational capability. Communication with Yona and her team was increasingly precarious. Static swallowed the words, turning crucial messages into unintelligible fragments. Zev tried to concentrate, trying to decipher the sounds of gunfire and explosions coming through the radio, looking for any hint that Yona was safe, that the radar team was advancing. But uncertainty was a poison, eroding his resolve. "Commander, the radars are off." Yona's voice finally came, clear for a moment, but charged with exhaustion. "But we lost contact with the support team. We don't know where they are." Zev felt a lump in his throat. Yona's support team. More men. More lives. With each decision, the cost increased. He had prioritized the goal, but the price was becoming unbearable. The disillusionment with the perfection of the plan was almost palpable. The obsessive training, the replica of the island, every memorized detail. Everything seemed to fall apart in the face of the brutal reality of combat. "Yona, regroup with what's left of your team and head to the secondary extraction point. I repeat, secondary extraction point. We can't wait," Zev ordered, his voice firm but with an almost imperceptible tremor. He was repeating the same order he had given Aitan, and with each repetition, the guilt deepened. Ariel, at his side, finished deactivating the last system in the command center. The room plunged into near-total darkness, only the emergency lights flickering faintly. "Ready, Commander." "The command center is neutralized." Zev nodded, but there was no triumph on his face. The island was blind, deaf, disorganized, but at a cost. He turned to the door, knowing that the shooter was still outside. They needed to leave. "Let's go. We need to find an escape route," Zev said, his voice low. They moved to the door, Zev in front, rifle drawn. He opened the door cautiously. Peering into the hallway, the smoke had cleared, revealing the empty hallway. But the feeling that they were not alone persisted. It was a heavy silence, loaded with expectation. They moved forward, their footsteps echoing in the hallway. Zev felt every muscle tense, every nerve on alert. The pain in his shoulder was a constant reminder, but he pushed it to the back of his mind. He needed to concentrate. Suddenly, a subtle, almost inaudible sound came from a side room. Zev stopped, raising his hand to Ariel. He could hear a heavy breath, a muffled moan. Someone was there. He approached the door of the room, his rifle pointed. With a quick movement, he opened the door. The room was dark, but the dim light coming from the hallway revealed a figure lying on the floor. It was an Egyptian soldier, wounded, groaning in pain. Next to him, a large-caliber sniper rifle. Zev felt a shiver down his spine. It was the shooter. He had been wounded, but he was not dead. And he was there, at their mercy. Zev approached, the rifle pointed at the man. The Egyptian soldier looked up, a mixture of pain and defiance on his face. Zev hesitated. The plan was to shut down the systems and disappear. There were no orders to deal with prisoners, especially a wounded one. But leaving him there, injured, was a decision that would also have its consequences. The moral dilemma deepened. "Commander, what do we do?" Ariel whispered, her voice strained. Zev looked at the Egyptian soldier, then at Ariel. The island, once a symbol of security, was now a stage for disorder, a testimony to the shattering of an illusion. And Zev, the experienced commander, felt the weight of every step, every decision, every life that was in his hands. The night was still long, and the dawn, which had previously represented the end of the mission, now seemed a distant and uncertain horizon, loaded with unknown consequences. He knelt beside the Egyptian soldier, ignoring the pain in his shoulder. The man was bleeding, but the wound did not appear fatal. Zev grabbed a first aid kit from his belt and began to treat the soldier's wound. Ariel watched him, an expression of surprise on his face. "Commander, we don't have time for this," Ariel said, her voice filled with urgency. Zev did not answer. He continued to treat the soldier's wound, his movements precise and controlled. He could not leave a man to die, even if he was an enemy. It was a decision he knew could have consequences, but it was a decision he needed to make. When he finished, he stood up, looking at the Egyptian soldier. The man watched him with an expression of confusion, of surprise. Zev said nothing. He just turned and walked out of the room, Ariel following him closely. They continued to advance, the island now a maze of dark, silent corridors. With every step, Zev felt the weight of his decisions, the invisible cost that accompanied each quiet victory. The mission had been accomplished, but the price was too evident to allow any sense of simple triumph. The island, once a symbol of security, was now a testimony to the shattering of an illusion. And Zev, the experienced commander, felt the weight of every step, every decision, every life that was in his hands. The night was still long, and the dawn, which had previously represented the end of the mission, now seemed a distant and uncertain horizon, loaded with unknown consequences. The retreat from the island was a macabre ballet of shadows and silence, a stark contrast to the chaos of infiltration. Zev and Ariel moved with redoubled caution, every step calculated, every breath contained. The island, once a maze of dark corridors, now looked like a wounded monster, its moans drowned out by the distant sounds of battle that still echoed in its entanglements. Zev's shoulder pain was a constant, but he used it as a focus, a reminder that the mission wasn't over yet. Communication with Yona and her team was intermittent, punctuated by bursts of static and clipped words. Zev knew the young man was under immense pressure, leading what was left of his team to the secondary extraction point. With each radio silence, with each interruption, Zev's anguish increased. He had given the order. He had made the choice. Now he had to live with the consequences. As they made their way down a corridor that led to the bottom of the island, Zev noticed a detail that made him stop. On the floor, near a maintenance door, there was a small glowing object. He bent down, ignoring the pain in his shoulder, and picked up the object. It was a locket, engraved with a Star of David, the medallion of Aitan. Zev felt a shiver down his spine. Aitan had been instructed to go to the secondary extraction point, but the medallion was there, in a place that was not part of the planned escape route. That was an ambiguous sign, an enigma. Had Aitan been captured, injured? Or had he deviated from the plan for some reason that Zev couldn't comprehend? The deep doubt about his own choices, about the decision to leave him behind, deepened. Ariel, at his side, watched the medallion with an expression of concern. "Commander, this is not good. Aitan would never part with that." Zev nodded, the locket heavy in his hand. The island, which had once been a military target, now became a stage for disorder, a testimony to the shattering of an illusion. And Zev, the experienced commander, felt the weight of every step, every decision, every life that was in his hands. The night was still long, and the dawn, which had previously represented the end of the mission, now seemed a distant and uncertain horizon, loaded with unknown consequences. They continued to advance, but with each step, Zev felt the presence of Eitan, the image of the skeptical veteran, with his eyes that had already seen too much haunting him. He had trusted Zev, and Zev had left him behind. Guilt was a heavy burden, a constant reminder of the unseen cost that accompanied every quiet victory. Finally, they reached the secondary extraction point, a small rocky cove at the bottom of the island. The water was dark, rough, and the inflatable boat that was waiting for them swayed gently with the waves. Yona and what was left of her team were already there, their faces scarred by exhaustion and tension. "Commander!" Yona exclaimed, relieved to see them. "We did it, but we lost 2 more men in the retreat and there is no sign of Eitan." Zev felt a blow to his stomach, more losses, and Eitan. The emotional break was almost complete. The frustration with the situation, the distancing of part of his team, the disillusionment with the perfection of the plan, the deep doubt about his own choices. All of this piled up, creating unbearable pressure. He showed Eitan's locket to Yona. The young man widened his eyes, a look of shock on his face. No, he would never take it away. Zev nodded, his voice low. "I know. It is not at the main extraction point, and it's not here." He deviated from the plan. Ariel, who was standing next to Zev, looked at the commander. "Commander, dawn is approaching. We need to go. We can't wait any longer." Zev looked up at the horizon where the first rays of sunlight were beginning to tint the sky a pale gray. The emotional deadline, the dawn, was running out. He had to make a decision, a final decision. He looked at Eitan's locket in his hand, then at the dark sea. The island, once a symbol of security, was now a stage for disorder, a testimony to the shattering of an illusion. And Zev, the experienced commander, felt the weight of every step, every decision, every life that was in his hands. The night was still long, and the dawn, which had previously represented the end of the mission, now seemed a distant and uncertain horizon, loaded with unknown consequences. He gritted his teeth, the pain in his shoulder pulsing in sync with the anguish in his chest. He had promised himself that he would leave no man behind. But the reality of the war was cruel, unforgiving. He couldn't risk everyone else's lives for a single man, even if that man was Eitan, the skeptical veteran who had trusted him. "Get into the boat," Zev ordered, his voice hoarse. "Let's go, now." Yona and the other men hesitated for a moment, their eyes fixed on the commander. They knew what that meant. They were leaving Eitan behind. But Zev's order was final. They got into the boat, their movements slow, heavy. Zev was the last to enter, his eyes fixed on the island, on the darkness that still enveloped her. He felt the weight of Eitan's locket in his hand, a symbol of a broken promise, of a life he had failed to protect. The boat pulled away from the island, cutting through the dark water. Dawn was fast approaching, tinting the sky with shades of orange and pink. The island, once a towering fortress, now seemed like a distant shadow, a ghost on the horizon. On the deck of the larger vessels, no one spoke. Eyes avoided crossing. The mission had been accomplished, but the price was too evident to allow any sense of simple triumph. Zev felt the emptiness in his chest, the guilt eating away at his soul. He had made the right decision, the decision necessary for the success of the mission and for the safety of the men who were still under his command. But the emotional cost, he knew, would haunt him forever. The island had been dismantled, its illusion of invulnerability shattered, but at an invisible cost, a cost that Zev would carry in his heart.